I was in juvenile hall. There was a huge fight, and they put this youth in the hallway. So this kid was using heroin, he burnt mattresses, he was known as the worst gangster in juvenile hall. And so I just sat down with him, and he says, you know, my brother died in my arms, and he was 14 years old, and I'm responsible for him for getting into a gang. And so he started crying, and you don't cry in juvenile hall. So I said, Eric, did you go to your brother's funeral? And he says, because I was there when my brother was killed, even though I had nothing to do with it, I had to be brought to camp. So the night before, the guard told me that I could go. So I got up, I dressed, and in the morning, the guard came, he came to my cell, and he looked at me and he says, you know, Eric, you're a piece of shit. He says, all you guys are. He says, I'm not bringing you to your brother's funeral. And so, and he says, I've never felt such rage. And so he never got to go. I said, well, let's go. So I asked him to close his eyes. And so this is what we do in our own retreats and in meditation, where he, through his imagination, walked into the church, saw his brother in the coffin, and we had a conversation with his brother, and he was crying the whole time. And he says, Carnal, I love you more than anybody else in the whole world, and I never got to say goodbye to you, and I never got to your funeral. But I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry. He got down on his knees, and he says, in those days they used this language, he says, de mi palabra, I promise I will, for your honor, and he called his brother, I will leave my gang life. So he began a movement that began in juvenile hall, and we have 400 names of kids that have signed the Book of Life called Warriors of Light, and we have a little prayer book that goes with it. And that little story goes to today in June of 2019, where he has been commuted by the governor. He's going to go to Valley State next week, and he's going to be accredited in the alcohol drug program, and when he gets out, he can get a very good job. He was given 250 years when he went to court, and then he was called back, and then he got 50 to life. In his own unit, he did so well. And so the last time I talked to him, with all the new laws that have been changed through the hard work of many people, we were having together a dinner in 2 years. So that, to me, is about hope. You don't give up on people. And basically, any good ministry is about healing.
A young man who was in our victim offender education group, his name was Isaac. His very first memory at 5 years old was his mother's ex-boyfriend coming over and slitting the throat of her current boyfriend in front of him, and he watched the man die. And nothing was done to help Isaac deal with this. At 11, he was out on the streets, joined a gang, and at 17, killed a rival gang member and was on trial for it, was found guilty. And Leonard was the name of the young man that he killed. Isaac said when he went to court that day for sentencing, and he knew he had a chance to talk, and he was just going to get up and say, you know, I don't care about anyone else. No one's cared about me in my life. You can do whatever you want to me. But then Leonard's mother got on the stand, and she looked at him and said, Isaac, you are a very young man, and I know that you're better than this worst thing that you've done. And I know that you can do some wonderful things in your life, and I hope that you do. And I want you to know that I forgive you. Then it came Isaac's turn to talk, and he couldn't. And he said the first thought that came to him was fear, because he realized that no one had ever loved him before, and he didn't know how to deal with it. And so he spent a lot of time thinking about this afterward. He was sentenced to 50 years to life. And he said he came to realize that everything that he was going to do from that point on in his life had to be done motivated by love to honor this woman. He said it just amazed him that the first one ever to show any love to him was the mother of the guy that he killed. And he ended his story by saying, "She gave me a heart." That to me is what restorative justice is all about. It's both, and I think, I wish that she could see what Isaac has done since then, because I think that would help her a lot. And it's certainly what she did has transformed his life completely.
I'd be in camps and the volunteers would line kids up. Who wants to go to confession with the priest, you know? And they never wanted to go to confession. They didn't know what confession was. They just wanted attention. They wanted a blessing. I can remember a kid came over with a swagger. And I said, "Hi, I'm Father Greg. What's your name?" And he said, "Sniper." I said, "Well, I know that you did not pop out of your mom and she took one look at you and called you Sniper." I said, "What's your name?" And he says, "Gonzalez." And I said, "Well, I know the staff here calls you by your last name. But, okay, here's what I'm looking for. What does your mom call you?" And he says, "Cabron," you know. And I said, "There's no doubt that she does. I'm looking for birth certificate." And then I watch him go from like 15 going on 30 to suddenly he's his age. And he gets very shy and quiet and he says, "Napoleon." I said, "Wow, that's kind of a historic name. I still don't believe your mom calls you Napoleon. What's the apodo? What's the nickname?" And then he gets quiet and distant and he says, "Sometimes when my mom's not mad at me, she calls me Napito." And big tears in his eyes. Well, he went from Sniper to Gonzalez to Cabron to Napoleon to Napito. He didn't need confession. He needed somebody to be reverent in his presence and to remind him of the truth of who he is, that he's exactly what God had in mind when God made him.
Years ago, we used to have a number of lockdowns. And these were the times when the prisons were really, excessively overcrowded. And so there were more problems, more fights, and more lockdowns. And, it became a vicious cycle, actually. And I remember during one of those lockdowns, I was in my office and not expecting any of the inmates to come by because they were on lockdown. But it was time for some of them to go get their medication. And so they were going to the clinic, which was not far from my office. And so one of these guys who went to get the meds saw my door open. And so he came to my office. And he came to do some paperwork because he wanted to sign for the vegetarian diet. That was part of one of the things that we also had to take care of at the prison, we as chaplains. And so he was a young man, and so we started a little conversation as he was filling out those papers. He came to say that it was the third time he was in prison. And basically what led him to prison was, he told me that the main reason was because of drugs and alcohol. And so I invited him to kind of go a little deeper in what was driving him to drugs and alcohol. And he said to me, "I already know what it is." He said, "I am a raped child." And that really blew me away. I was not expecting that. I didn't know what to do, but I picked up my Bible there, and I opened and I looked for Psalm 139. And so he had finished his part of the form, so I said, "Here, why don't you read this?" So he started reading Psalm 139 from the Bible, right, as I was doing my part. I thought he was going to read it quietly, but he started reading out loud. And when he got to the point where he said, "For it was you who created my being, knit me together in my mother's womb," he stood up and said, "So, It was God who made me. It wasn't that man. And I said, exactly. There are many women that are raped and don't get pregnant. God wanted you to be. God loved you, and God wanted you to come into existence. And so he started really literally jumping for joy and said, nobody told me that. I had no idea. And so from that day on, it was like seeing a whole different person. I mean, he started thinking, seeing himself in a whole different way. Started dreaming about the future with his mother, who was deaf. And so he started learning sign language because his mother was learning sign language. And he started thinking how he was going to communicate, because he was going to be released like in 6 or 8 months. So it was to me, amazing how God works in tremendous ways.
I met a young woman in the women's prison in Purdy, Washington, where I was also the director of prison work. And I was the chaplain there. And I spent a lot of time with her. She was a character and a half, and to this day we're friends. She played the guitar at all the Catholic services. She really knew a lot about the church, and she was, always talking about it, and talking about her children, a lot about her children, especially her daughter. She was serving a life sentence. And in Washington, if you got 20 years to life, at 13 years, 4 months, you would be reviewed. And if your record was good inside and you had done a lot of good things, they would review you for parole. Well, in Washington State, she was talking to her daughter because they were coming up upon the 13 years. And her daughter was just about that. I think she's 12 or something. And no, I think she was a little older. I think she might have been 14. And Cynthia always talked about her daughter. When I get out, my daughter and I are going to do this and we're going to do that, and all this reunion planning, because it was getting close. The Department of Corrections decided to change their finish line, and now people had to do 20 years before they were reviewed. Well, that was really hard for her mother, but it was really hard for the teenager. So I, at the time, was on the council for the Sisters of St. Joseph, and I came to LA every month for a few days for meetings. And while I was here, I got a phone call that Cynthia's daughter had overdosed and aspirated and died. And I mean, I was sobbing because I knew how devastating this was going to be. And I thought, I am not going back to that prison to see Cynthia unless I see her parents. So I don't know how I tracked their name down. I think by looking at the funeral, and I found their name and phone number, and I called them. They were in Northern California, and said that I was a chaplain at the prison and I would like to come to see them before I returned to see Cynthia. And they were, oh, yes. So I went, and I spent 11 hours there. And we went off to dinner, and we did everything. I mean, they told the story, and I saw her room, and I picked up the cross and the Bible to take back to her mother. When I got to the front door to leave, the grandmother said to me, "We prayed to God to help us, to send us something, because we were so devastated, and God sent you. For us, you are an angel." And I pondered that so much, because in so many ways, oftentimes we are the answer to someone else's prayer. Sometimes we know that, and sometimes we don't. So it's a very powerful experience to realize that.
So I had to go to the prison one day to pick up some materials, and I see this woman coming out of the prison, and she's clearly devastated. And this was an off time; it wasn't a visiting time, and she was beside herself. And I said, what's going on?" And she said, "Oh, it's just really hard for me to come into the prison and see my son in such a terribly dehumanizing situation." She said, "Patrick is not a bad guy. He's just not a bad guy." And I hear, "Patrick." And I said, "Patrick?" is your son Patrick so-and-so? She says, yeah. Do you know him? I said, yeah. He's in my Monday night group, and he's one of the leaders of the group. You wouldn't have any idea what good things Patrick does for people. He's an incredible mentor to so many, particularly younger guys. And, you know, as you might imagine a mom would feel, somebody talking about her son who's been incarcerated for a long time in those kinds of terms. So after it's over, I get into my car and I think, that was total privilege for me. I didn't earn that. I didn't do anything that was special. I just happened to be there. And I could just as easily pass her by, could just as easily not said a word, because those are the definitions of a prison or penitentiary. You don't talk, you know, you're not hello, hello, hello. I happened to talk to her. She happened to be Patrick's mother, and I happened to have an encounter with her that had a phenomenal, just, you know, it helps you recognize you're not in charge of this deal.
A week ago, I went to a mental health workshop, and I brought along another lifer who's one of our house managers. He's new. He's getting all this training. And just before lunch, they did all of this training on suicide. I said, let's go and sit on the steps and talk a bit. And the phone rang, my phone rang, and it's someone I know who's considering suicide. He sat next to me, and I started processing with this individual on the phone. And he said, motioned to me, do you want me to leave? I said, no, stay here. I said, just be. And he just intently looked at me and gave me courage to go through this very difficult, painful conversation. And at the end of it, it moved to a better place. He said, everything that we just learned in there, I saw it before me working. And I said, but you know what? I couldn't have done it without you. You held the space. You helped me know I was safe and I could do this with your strength. And we gave each other a hug, and I said, I can't tell you what that did for me having you. You were strong in this presence.
There was a company who had the tents where they're fumigating homes, and somebody decided they would break into it and slice it and go in. Well, of course, there are poisons. And their alarms went off, and that person was caught by the police. And it was agreed that the owners of the company agreed that they would mediate this crime and talk with him because he was a young man. And the solution that came out of this was that he needed to pay for what he had done. But instead of going to be put away into juvenile hall or to jail or wherever he may have gone, that he would work for this company. And he was at risk, a young man at risk of going down the wrong path. So they had him come and work off his damage that he had done, which was several $1,000s worth of damage to their equipment. And he would learn a trade, and he would get on the right path. So that's restorative justice.
It's been interesting because, like, when we have Mass on Sunday at the men's jail, at least half our congregation that come out are not Catholic. And I asked them once, and they said, you know, you are the only faith here that doesn't condemn us. He says, too often the other faiths, they said, talk about how we're horrible sinners, and, you know, it's thanks to Jesus that you're even going to have any possibilities at all. But you guys talk about how wonderful we are and the dignity that we have as the people that God created us to be. And even if we don't see that that's still in us and we've got to try to find that. You always treat us with respect. And he said, that's more important to us than what faith you happen to be. And he said, it also tells us what your faith is. One of the best stories that is Patty Patty Bartlett, who is the senior Catholic chaplain at Men's Central Jail, been there for 19 years. She's everyone's mother, and she loves them to death, and she tells them off. And she got a letter from a guy, and it started out, which isn't what you'd think a chaplain would be receiving, saying, "Thank you so much for not talking to me about God when I was at Men's Central Jail." He said, when we were together, you let me set the agenda. We talked about the things that were important to me, the things I needed some kind of help with. You never talked to me about God, but you showed me who God is. And he said, when I got up to prison, the first thing that I did is I went to the chaplain and told him I wanted to go to confession and I wanted to get back, coming back to Mass regularly.